This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Thank you for joining us. This weekend we observe the autumnal equinox, the official start of fall. But our lawmakers are still in session, and this week we ask why our state Senate hasn't taken a vote on overriding Governor Cooper's budget veto. We look at the maps lawmakers drew in response to a court order and ask if those new legislative districts are less partisan. And we discuss budget-busting shortfalls in our Department of Transportation. And of course, we'll ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Speaking of the panel, this week they include Tamara Barringer, former state senator, John Hood, syndicated columnist and author, Chris Fitzsimon, director of the Newsroom, and Howard Lee, former senator and former chair of the State Board of Education. We'll begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages from our underwriters.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
Let's get started. It's been more than a week since the House staged a surprise vote to override Governor Cooper's veto. Now it's up to the Senate. Howard Lee, why hasn't the Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger put the veto override vote on the floor? Doesn't he have the votes? Is he waiting for the furor to die down about the House's action? What's going on?
I think the President Pro Tem was certainly surprised when the bill came out of the House and hadn't had an opportunity to get his act together. I'm convinced that he's not putting the bill on the floor because he does not have the votes. I think when he had one vote short, he could have probably persuaded a Democrat to cross over. But now with Dan Bishop out of the Senate, that leaves him 2 votes short, which I think is a more difficult challenge.
So my question, Tamara, is you reckon he's waiting for the replacement? I mean, they've suspended operation. They're not going to have any more votes until the end of the month, they said. They're going to have cursory kinds of meetings just to say that they're still in session. But they're not going to have any more votes until the end of the month. Is that because they're waiting for Dan Bishop's replacement?
Well, that could be true, but it's also true that the governor's putting tremendous pressure on the Democrats not to vote for the budget. I'd like to talk about the furor over in the House. The Democrats got caught flat-footed. When in the House, the rules, they obviously didn't know the rules. The House rules are that you have to have 60 members present to vote. That's called quorum. Well, there were only 56 Republicans there. This bill didn't have to cross over or come over had the Democrats just gotten up, known the rules, and walked out. But instead, they didn't do that. And of course, now to answer your question, Senator Berger obviously knows the rules of the Senate, and so does Senator Dan Blue, who is the Democratic
Majority leader.
Exactly, the minority leader. The minority leader. And so it's going to be very interesting to watch this showdown.
Yeah, John, you wrote a very good column on this week. In fact,
it happens every so often.
Well, I complimented you on it, but explain what you got to the bottom of this whole thing, you think?
Well, I think so, and I think it was, I truly think that what happened in the House was a misunderstanding between the House Rules Chair, David Lewis, and the House Minority Leader, Darren Jackson. And I think it was a kind of I wouldn't call it quite an accident, but it was a remarkable coincidence of confusion, because the Republicans had it in their minds, because of some comments Democrats had made a few days earlier, that the Democrats were rejecting that the redistricting court order applied to them. It only applied to Republicans, it didn't apply to Democrats. So Democrats were trying to hatch something, and they could do it because the court order didn't apply. So they had this, I think, rumor that was not founded going through the Republican ranks. Some of the whips called a few of the members who commute in and said, make sure you're there. And this was not an act. They really thought there was some kind of redistricting motion that may happen. So they were there, more or less. Not enough. As Tamara said, there really weren't still 64, 65 votes, but there were enough there with the Democrats. I think good faith understanding there wouldn't be any votes on any bills didn't arrive. Then we had this confusion. Unfortunately, in my view, a possible reconciliation or reconsideration was made impossible when the national story broke, when everybody claimed that it was about a 9/11 memorial, which it was not.
But the fundamental error of judgment was the Speaker. I'm sorry, we have to get back to that. Speaker Moore knew when he looked out at the House that the majority...
That he had the votes.
Obviously, but he also knew that the Democrats in the House believed there would be no votes that day.
That is not correct. Who says that?
Of course. Why would he think there were only 9 there if he thought they were going to vote?
There were all sorts of things happening in the building.
John, he knew that they were not. They
What is the
had a
proof for
misunderstanding. Well, David Lewis told people. David Lewis told the staff. David Lewis told reporters.
David Lewis
is the House Rules
is
Chair.
the source of the confusion.
That's
but
right.
As
So
far
David
as I know,
Lewis should take
no one.
responsibility for that.
That's right, but that's not the. You're saying the Speaker
I'm saying
knew
the
what was
Speaker- I'm
happening in
saying
the
the-
moment,
I'm saying-
and that is clearly not the case.
I'm not saying he knew what happened in the moment. I'm saying that day after day after day, people left chemotherapy to come to the House floor so they wouldn't override the veto. So then all of a sudden, one day when he thinks, we're going to vote on the budget in his mind, and he looks out and there's 9 people there, does he think 40 people just decided after fighting through health problems to be on the floor that they weren't going to show up?
Okay.
That's insane.
Time out on this.
That's ridiculous.
Okay, I got it. We've debated this.
I don't think he's that good an actor. I just don't think so.
I'm not saying he's an actor.
Howard, there's a rumor that's been floating around Raleigh the last few days that the pro tem might have the votes, in fact. They want to get Dan Bishop's replacement back. And there might be one Democrat that would cross over and vote for this because of the fact that there is some big money in it so far as his district is concerned. Have you heard anything like that? Do you think it's possible?
I think in politics, anything is possible, but I would be surprised if any Democrat under the circumstances would cross over and walk the plank to vote for in favor of this. And I'd hate to be that Democrat.
Even
because
one who was getting like a $200 million building in there?
I agree with Howard. I just think that it is not a likely scenario that a Democrat will cross over.
It's also interesting, sorry to interrupt, it's also interesting, not only has Senator Bishop's replacement not been named, there's one Republican senator who's in Europe or is about to go to Europe. So a lot of these senators, understandably, plan vacation, so a lot of this stuff is timing, and if you have to need every single vote even to get close, and you don't have people in town.
And he has to have every
That's
vote.
right.
And
That's
one
right.
Democrat.
That's
Tamara,
right.
so far as it goes, what does this do for Medicaid expansion? The House has put together a bill, which is called House Bill 655, that expands Medicaid, but it requires a work provision. People have to have a job, and they have to pay 2% of what they earn as a premium, an insurance premium for getting it. Democrats are pretty incensed about this, but is this a compromise that might pass the House?
I think it very well may, and I think it's a good start for us to start talking about things. One of the things that we'll talk about a little later in the show you've announced is how well the process worked for the redistricting map drawing. Well, I think we need to apply that same kind of process to issues like this so that we can make
But John,
changes.
will it go anywhere? And let's assume that it does pass the House, and it seems it's gotten out of committee. It's going to be taken up again when the House reconvenes to vote after the end of the month. Would it go anywhere in the Senate?
I doubt it.
Is it tolerable? And if it could pass, Howard, would it be tolerable to Governor Cooper?
I don't think so. And I don't think it'd go anywhere in the Senate either. I just think people are so dug in on their positions on this one that there probably is not going to be any compromise.
So, Chris, where are we? You talked about the length of this session. We started this, the first opening day was like January 6th. They adjourned for a week or so and came back, and they got organized and really got started. Here we are now, the end of September. Is any end in sight for this session?
Well, I think it's going to end at some point. Whether there's whether the legislators are satisfied with the budgets, the mini budgets that they've passed, some of which the governor has signed. It's worth pointing out that the Medicaid bills to expand Medicaid were introduced the first couple weeks of the session. The House has had their version of Medicaid expansion, which they took off and changed and made different, and I think made a little worse. That's been on the calendar for a couple months. So part of the inaction is it's all been part of the gamesmanship and the budget negotiations. We could have had hearings on Medicaid expansion since January.
Are they waiting to adjourn until they find out what the court's going to do on these maps, John?
Redistricting is one of the reasons they have not adjourned and will not adjourn until there is resolution, both on what the maps look like right now, and also whether redistricting reform is enacted.
Which brings us to our next topic. In compliance with the ruling by 3 Superior Court judges, both the House and the Senate have redrawn legislative districts. Now, the process was not without controversy, especially in the House. Tamara, the maps have now been submitted to the judges for review. Even some Democrats are saying this was the most transparent process in which they've participated. Are these maps going to pass muster?
Well, I agree with you in that this is a very exciting development, that we have the most contentious, or one of the most contentious political issues being able to be solved by Democrats and Republicans coming together. And it gives me hope. It gives me hope when you see Dan Blue actually endorse and vote for this, when you see even the Democrats who voted against it say good things about it. It gives me great hope that when we approach things like Medicaid reform, or we look at child welfare, that we can use these same skills to do that. Now, as a potential statewide judicial candidate, I cannot speculate about what the court will do, but I will tell you this is really, really wonderful news for the state of North Carolina.
Howard, would you call this a bipartisan effort here? I think in the Senate it seemed to be more than it was in the House. There was a fair amount of contention in the House.
I'm not seeing a lot of agreement on this. I'm finding that some Democrats are very unhappy with the way this plan has come out, especially when it focuses so much on incumbency. Of course, I'm a victim of redistricting, so I can understand how they would feel. And I believe there's a lot of unhappiness on both sides, both Republicans and Democrats. So I don't see the harmony that I'm hearing about.
Chris Michael Bitzer, who has sort of been our guru, we've had him on the show before and follow him, professor of political science at Catawba, did a detailed study of these maps, and he said that that after having seen them drawn, the districts still favor Republicans. Now, does that mean that?
By the way.
Does that mean that, okay, can you draw maps?
There have been several analyses that show
well,
this.
not overwhelmingly, but
that is not correct.
That's not what he said,
Okay.
but anyway.
There are analyses that show them with significant, the same margins roughly as they have now.
Whose?
Okay.
Nobody ever says that.
Even though they were drawn and may favor Republicans more, does it mean they are without political consideration? Because that was the key thing that
they
the
are
judges
without political consideration, because it would have been evident, but that doesn't mean they aren't without incumbent consideration, which then affects political consideration. You know, I think that the open door the court left that shouldn't have been opened, and I think the only way you can close it is by passing reform, is to get rid of incumbency protection. I think that's essential.
I think the lesson of this, I found this whole process shocking and disturbing. I hope every North Carolinian did. Not that it was bipartisan, good for them, but we could watch on video a state senator or representative in the House walk up to a computer terminal and say, wow, this is my district. I'd rather have these 2 Republican precincts over here and move this Democratic precinct out of here so I'll be safer.
There was that.
There just wasn't that. That was common and
No, I mean, you saw that going
Absolutely.
on.
And I think
you were right about that, Chris. However, these new maps are less protective of incumbents than the old. I mean, there are more competitive seats.
I understand that, but we're still letting politicians draw their, not just the overall districts, but draw specific districts to help themselves. That's the fundamental problem with the way we do this.
Tamara, the key thing these judges are going to have to determine, as I understand it, is whether or not these new maps are gerrymandered. Using terminology for gerrymandering, would you say they were or weren't?
Well, again, I'm not in a position to be able to predict what a court might say or do, but when you have Senator Jeff Jackson, one of the leaders in the Senate for the Democrats, praising the maps, even though he did ultimately vote against them because he believes it should be a non-political process. When you see that, it's hard to not be excited.
Howard, one of the things that's been interesting to me as a fallout of all of this after the maps, the plaintiffs in this case have not really been raising Cain about it. I mean, they've been, they opposed it. Some said they didn't like it or whatever like that. Is that because they know that these 3 judges are going to appoint Nate Pursley, who is a special master, to review them, and they have confidence, since he was the one who was involved in the Covington case to start off with, that he'll draw new maps?
I certainly think that's playing a major role in how people are responding at this point. Because when I read it, I thought, well, it looks like this is probably not going to pass muster and the judges are going to appoint somebody to do it. I think that gets us closer to where I'd like to see us as a state and a nation anyway. That is having impartial organizations draw these maps and get it out of the political arena. But, and it's also difficult to understand what actually is the outcrop of this whole problem.
Another question on this, though, is, okay, particularly when you look down east, these maps are all red because people down east are more predominantly registered Republican. But just because somebody is registered Republican or Democrat, does that mean that's how they're going to vote, John?
That's not how they measure it. They don't measure it by registration.
I got that.
They measure it by how people vote.
But the analysis shows that, though.
Yeah, the analysis is based on how they vote, not how they're registered. I mean, there's still way more Democrats than Republicans in these regions, but many of those Democrats are operationally Republican. They vote Republican. Now, there's some flip side of that now happening in some of the urban places where you got people who are registered independent or even in some cases Republican who used to vote for ours who now cross over sometimes and vote Democrat.
All right, so these judges have got, as I see it, three options here. They can accept these maps. They can refute the maps and either send them back to the legislature and tell them to redraw them again, or they can let their special master, Nate personally, redraw them.
Option number 2 does not exist.
They're not going to send them back.
And actually, I think there is three. I think one option is they will reject both maps and have them drawn by personally. Another option is they accept both maps. I think a very likely possibility is they accept the Senate maps, but they order some redrawing of the House maps. If they reject both sets of maps, even though the Senate maps were not particularly controversial in the Senate, as far as the actual outcome of the map, I think that would be telling that the three-judge panel is playing politics, and they shouldn't do that.
The three-judge panel with one Republican. We should make it clear it's not an all-Democratic panel.
That's right.
I mean,
but let me just ask again the question I asked in the earlier segment. Does this mean, does this process help or hurt the fact that we might have legislative redistricting reform?
It helps a lot, and I think that redistricting reform was already likely, and now I think it's even more likely.
Let's move on. Just before Hurricane Dorian hit our state, the North Carolina Department of Transportation announced it was having to adjust the schedule for road construction projects because of a lack of funding. There are two main culprits for the shortage of money. The first involves the extraordinary funds required to repair roads after Hurricanes Matthew and Florence. The second is some $300 million owed landowners as a result of the court ruling on the MAP Act. Chris, DOT says not only will they have to come up with the $300 million, but could end up owing as much as $1 billion to settle these lawsuits. Help us understand this MAP Act.
Well, basically, before the court ruled, the Department of Transportation could put a hold on property that was adjacent to people's lands, that affected the property values of their own land, sometimes their own property, because they were going to build a road sometime in the future. And they held it for years, 20 years, 30 years, and it infringed on the property rights of the people who own the property. And now the lawsuit says they can't do that anymore, and they have to compensate some of these people who've been
Howard,
hurt.
this law was passed in 1987. I don't think you were in the legislature back in 1987, but who in the world ever thought this was a good idea? Essentially, as Chris said, what's going on is we're telling these property owners you can't do anything with your property. You can't sell it, you can't improve it. You've got to sit and wait until the day comes that DOT is going. Who thought this was a good idea?
I don't really know. I inherited it when I became chairman of transportation in 1990, and of course we were struggling with how to respond to that at that time. I've always thought it was a terrible idea, and the chickens are finally coming home to roost, so we shouldn't be surprised that we're losing on this one.
Tamara, I wrote a column about this week. In disclosure, I'm supposed to say this, I wrote a column about this subject this week. One of the suggestions I made is instead of sending this $896 million surplus the state has to the taxpayers, let's use it to help fund the crisis we've got in DOT. What do you think of that?
Well, that may be a very good option because we are up against a wall here. It's very, very concerning. This is the perfect example of where bureaucrats were not looking at what was important to the citizens or what was important to the taxpayers at that time. Instead, it was bureaucracy at its finest. That's one of the reasons that the legislature has now actually voted to remove the MAP Act from the laws of the state of North Carolina.
I was talking more specifically about using the surplus that we've got right now to help take care of some of these shortages.
And that very well may be the solution to do it. I know that Senator Kravick, for years, she's from the Winston-Salem area, and she has been working on this issue, and these are not insignificant dollars.
John, okay. We spent $300 million on Matthew and Florence, and by the way, rock slides and snowstorms and other weather-related events. The average has been $65 million. From 2004 to 2016, it was $65 million a year that we were spending on these events. Last year, it came in at $225. This year, $300 million. Why are we taking these money out of the rainy day funds instead of taking them out of the operating and repairs budget of DOT?
Because the rainy day funds are a general fund item and roads are not. The road system is
but
supposed
it's
to
a
be
rainy day
funded.
event.
No. Well, that's
It's a
not what it
crisis
means.
emergency.
Yeah, look, I think that it is reasonable, perhaps defensible, to take some money out of general fund savings for litigation settlement, to handle lawsuit costs. I do not think we should be using it for roads. That's why we have a system that is user paid, where people pay gas taxes and car taxes. And if we need over time, we need more money than we currently have in the highway system, I would be in favor of increasing highway revenue, but not raiding the general fund.
DOT Secretary Jim Trogdon has been saying for years, ever since he's been in office, this administration and others, we got to find better ways of funding. Right, recently we've been using what's called Garvey bonds, which are grant anticipation revenue vehicles. In essence, what that amounts to is we're borrowing anticipated funds that we expect the federal government to send to us today in order to build roads today, but it takes away tomorrow's money.
We've talked about it on the show before. The fundamental issue is we have a declining revenue source in the gas tax. As cars are more tax efficient, fuel efficient, there are more electric cars on the road, and we're still using a system that was designed a long time ago. We have to come to grips with that. The problem is none of the alternatives are politically popular.
No.
The vehicle miles traveled, which seems to make the most common sense, is opposed dramatically by some folks, either who don't understand it or who don't think,
well, but
who think
tourists
they're going to
wouldn't
pay
be
more.
paying into that fund. I want to talk.
Yeah, they would.
I want to talk. Well.
Yeah, but it depends on how you do it.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to talk to you guys that have been in the legislature, because we've been talking about this subject since 1998 when NC Spend first went on the air. We've been talking about transportation funding. We have been kicking this can down the road. I remember Mike Easley. When he was governor, there was a $25 billion shortfall projected for the year 2025. We've been kicking this. When are we going to stop doing that and come to grips with how are we going to fund roads?
Well, it is worth pointing out that the legislature took significant actions in these regards since 2013, including essentially raising the gas tax, which happened. People didn't get all screamy about it because they did it in a very clever way, but that's essentially what they did, is raise the long-term gas tax revenue. It wasn't sufficient. They also stopped transferring money out of the highway fund into the general fund, which was a good idea. So there has been some improvement along these lines, but more is necessary.
There's no question about it.
And I'm very excited about this conversation because it's a quandary. We haven't tackled it or didn't tackle it when I was in the Senate.
You say mystery.
Exactly. But my students at the Keenan Flagler Business School are actually studying this and will be coming up with proposals about this.
So
it's solved.
It's all solved.
Yeah, well, here's what I see. I think we got three options. Number one is we can dramatically increase taxes and fees that we're charging to help fund roads. We can pass a multi-billion-dollar road bond referendum in order to be able to anticipate these needs, or we can put toll roads on the state.
Well, I personally think that the best option for me is passing a massive road bond to support our roads and our highways.
Let's go around the table here and get some feedback on that. John?
I don't want general funds going for roads. I would rather pay for it with a combination of tolls on highways for which that is appropriate and other kinds of charges based on how much people drive. I think that's the long-term.
People who use the roads ought to pay for it.
Absolutely. That's the long-term solution. Anything else is a Band-Aid.
Tamara.
Well, I see the benefit of the user fees that you're talking about, but when we're looking at things like roads that last for years, bonds should be part of the mix.
I think it's all the above. We have to have vehicle miles traveled at some point. I also think that there's a strong argument to be made that the trucking industry pays less taxes than the damage they cause in terms of maintenance on our highways.
And I think there's a very strong argument that I need to move on and ask you folks to tell us something we don't know. John Hood, I'll start with you.
I'll just be real quick. I think Tom Tillis's race in 2020 might be the one that decides control the U.S. Senate, because right now it's 53 Republicans. They're going to gain one in Alabama. If they lose the three obvious ones, Tom Tillis could be that last loss.
Tamara.
Expect Dan McCready to jump into the U.S. Senate race.
Interesting.
You've heard me say it many times. I think one of the great assets for our public schools is having strong leadership, and I'm proud to report that one of my low-performing elementary schools in Durham has shown tremendous growth.
Chris.
The Trump administration is finalizing a rule that will actually let the pork industry, pork producers, inspect themselves. So they will be responsible for telling us how they're doing in the pork plants, which I think should alarm us all.
I've got a couple real quick. Treasurer Dale Falwell got in touch with me this week, and he said, I want people to know that we're going to be unveiling the portrait of former Treasurer Richard Moore next Monday in the Treasurer's office. And any of the public who would like to attend, get in touch with his office. The other one is that next week, Brad Crone is going to be sitting in this chair, our good friend. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter, give your feedback, and read my weekly column. Visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. Until next week, as always, we tell you to stay informed and watch out for the spin.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.